You never truly grasp how fragile life is until one small moment knocks everything off balance. What was supposed to be a peaceful family getaway, a chance to reconnect in the mountains, became something Levi insisted on. He always cared about appearances, wanting to present us as a perfect, united family. Regardless of the fact that our marriage had long since turned into more of a business arrangement than a romantic connection. And Alexander, his son from his first marriage, had always been distant, never fully accepting me as his stepmother. I agreed to the trip, not out of excitement but simply out of habit. I followed the routine of agreeing, complying, and maintaining peace. But I didn't find peace that weekend. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. It started with a simple mistake, a mix-up with the lodge reservations. Levi had booked the wrong dates for our rooms, leaving us one short. He dismissed it casually, suggesting that Alexander and I share a room. He had merely stated it was for one night, dismissing it as such. As I lay next to Alexander in the dim light of our shared room, I realized how fragile the family dynamic we had constructed truly was. In retrospect, I ponder whether it was inevitable for everything to disintegrate eventually, or if that one night at the lodge catalyzed the unraveling. Regardless, the repercussions extended far beyond my initial comprehension. This is the narrative of how everything collapsed. The drive to the lodge was lengthy and silent, characterized by the kind of quiet that arises when individuals have little left to express. Levi was driving, concentrating on the road ahead, while I sat beside him, gazing out the window. Alexander occupied the back seat, immersed in his headphones, his eyes glued to his phone. This was not unfamiliar. Our family trips had always felt like this, three individuals moving independently, never genuinely connecting. "Did you bring the hiking boots?" I inquired, interrupting the silence. He curtly replied, "Yes," nodding, refocusing his attention on the road. Alexander seldom communicated throughout the journey. He rarely did, particularly in my presence. At 28, he possessed a subdued, focused demeanor that suggested he was perpetually concealing something. He had his mother's dark hair and pronounced features, perpetual reminders of the woman Levi had adored prior to my arrival. I did not detest Alexander for this. His mother had passed away during his adolescence, and a void emerged that no one, including Levi, could occupy. Still, a distance persisted between us, which neither of us endeavored to close. Upon our arrival at the lodge, the sun was setting, illuminating the mountains with a golden hue. The lodge was modest, rustic, and delightful, evoking memories of previous family trips. Levi facilitated our check-in as Alexander and I unpacked the vehicle. Alexander remarked on the pleasantness of the location while transporting luggage on the gravel. I responded, astonished that he was speaking. He cast a short glance at me before returning his attention to the car. The lodge exuded warmth and hospitality, characterized by wooden paneling and comfortable furnishings. Yet upon Levi's return from the front desk, his demeanor indicated that something was amiss. He stated that there had been a misunderstanding. He rubbed his hair in exasperation, noting that only 2 rooms were available tonight, the third wouldn't be ready until tomorrow. I gazed at him, comprehending the implications of this situation. "What are the next steps?" I asked. "We will resolve it," he stated succinctly. "I will reserve 1 room. You and Alexander may share the other." I experienced a knot in my gut but refrained from disputing it. Levi had already progressed beyond the matter, regarding it as a mere annoyance. The room shared by Alexander and me was compact yet inviting, featuring a queen-sized bed and a warm lamp that emitted a soft illumination over the comforter. The fragrance of pine wafted in through the open window. "This is cozy," Alexander remarked, his tone neutral, as he placed his suitcase down. I compelled a smile. "It is merely—" The discomfort was instantaneous. I attempted to divert my attention by organizing my belongings in the compact bathroom, while Alexander occupied himself with his phone. As night fell, the tension in the room was palpable. "You take the bed," Alexander said. I replied, "Don't be ridiculous. I can sleep on the floor." While standing by the window, shaking my head, I added, "The bed's big enough for both of us." He hesitated before nodding. I lay on one side of the bed, staring at the ceiling. Alexander lay beside me, breathing softly. I tried to convince myself it was fine, that nothing would happen, but deep down I knew better. That night, everything started to feel different. The room settled into a quiet calm. And the sound of crickets echoed outside. The soft light from the lamp cast shadows on the walls, creating a dreamlike atmosphere. Alexander was on one side of the bed, scrolling through his phone, while I pretended to read a book, but my mind was elsewhere. Dinner had been quiet, as most of our meals together had been. Levi recounted stories about his work, to which Alexander and I nodded in agreement, but neither of us was fully present. I couldn't pinpoint when the tension started. But maybe it had always been there, an underlying current that I had ignored for years. Now it was impossible to overlook. "You're not really reading that, are you?" Alexander asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "What makes you say that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He smirked, setting his phone down. "We've been in agreement for the past 20 minutes. I laughed softly. Embarrassed. Alexander shifted, and his body language seemed more relaxed than usual. "What's on your mind?" I wasn't expecting the question. My remarks were uttered hastily. He arched an eyebrow, evidently skeptical. "Come now, Abigail. I am more familiar with you than that." The manner in which he uttered my name caused my heart to momentarily falter. Although it was not the typical reference of stepmom or quiet, it conveyed a distinct sensation. I exhaled audibly, reclining against the headboard. I find myself reflecting on how circumstances once were. "Family excursions were once enjoyable," I said softly. "Correct," Alexander acquiesced, his expression becoming gentler. "Indeed. They were, during the time it was solely my father and me. Prior to my recognition of the superficiality of things." His statements resonated profoundly, albeit not due to their inaccuracy. "I have endeavored," I stated softly, "to facilitate this arrangement. I aspire to be a reliable individual for both you and your father." I recognize his gentle assertion and value it, even if I do not consistently express my gratitude. For the first time, it seemed the barriers between us were dissolving. We conversed for hours, expressing grievances over Levi and reminiscing about journeys Alexander had undertaken with his mother. "She was the adhesive," Alexander remarked, his tone imbued with longing. "Father consistently labored while mother provided a sense of wholeness." I acquiesced, my heart laden. It is challenging to meet the expectations of an individual of that caliber. He stated plainly. "That is not necessary," I replied. We descended into a placid silence, and the evening settled into an unspoken understanding. Silence. I extinguished the lamp, allowing the moonlight to flood the room. My leg contacted his. I apologized, whispering under my breath as I quickly pulled away. He stated that it was okay. His speech was subdued and tranquil, yet the moment felt distinct. Each minor movement he made appeared magnified, underscoring our proximity. "Are you well?" Alexander inquired gently, disrupting the silence. I faltered. "My throat feels parched." "I am well," I deceived. "I do not consider who you are," he remarked, his tone suddenly gentler. Prior to my response, he moved closer. His body heat enveloping me. I immobilized. "Do you ever feel like you're pretending?" he inquired abruptly, his tone unrefined, existing in a manner that is not authentically one's own. Fulfilling all obligations, yet never experiencing genuine reality. His comments resonated profoundly within me. "Every day," I acknowledged. The words that were suspended between us, unrefined and sincere, then came to pass. Neither dramatic nor premeditated, one moment we conversed in subdued tones, the next, his fingers grazed mine. And neither of us withdrew. "Is this acceptable?" he murmured. I should have said no. I should have gotten up and left the room, but instead, I turned toward him, my heart racing. "Yes," I whispered. When it was over, we lay in silence. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and guilt, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. "I'm sorry," Alexander said, his voice breaking the stillness. "Don't apologize," I replied quickly, my voice trembling. "It's fine." "I don't know what this means," he admitted. "Neither do I," I whispered, but deep down, I knew what it meant. The next morning, I woke before Alexander and slipped out of bed as quietly as I could. The soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a warm golden hue across the room. I dressed quickly, avoiding the mirror, and by the time Alexander stirred, I was sitting by the window, pretending to be absorbed in the view of the mountains. "Good morning," he mumbled. His voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, he hesitated, as if he wanted to say more. But he simply nodded and went into the bathroom without another word. When we met Levi in the dining room for breakfast, the tension between Alexander and me was palpable. Despite Levi being blissfully unaware. Alexander sipped his coffee and read the newspaper, occasionally commenting on the weather or our plans for the day. However, I could feel Alexander's gaze on me, heavy and searching, and it took all my willpower not to meet his eyes. I told myself that the tension would ease, the memory of the night before would fade. And we'd return to normal. But as the day wore on, I began to understand that some things, once done, could never be undone. The drive back from the lodge was quiet. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had hoped for, but one filled with an uncomfortable weight, as though every unspoken word and thought was pressing in on us. Levi was still oblivious to everything. Humming and tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding mountain roads. Alexander sat in the back seat, looking out the window while I stared ahead. My hands tightly folded in my lap. I tried to focus on the scenery outside, the rolling hills, the forests. The golden light filtering through the trees, but my thoughts kept circling back to the previous night. Every detail was burned into my memory, Alexander's breathing, the way his hand had brushed mine. It felt unreal, like a dream, and yet the consequences of it were clear and unavoidably present. I risked a glance at Alexander in the rearview mirror. He looked calm, almost indifferent. But I noticed the tension in his jaw and how his fingers gripped the armrest a little too tightly. We were both avoiding each other's gaze, and I didn't know if that was a relief or a punishment. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Levi was already stretching and making plans for the rest of the day. He announced, "I have a meeting in a couple of hours. But we should do something tonight, maybe dinner at that new Italian place." "Sure," I replied automatically, though the thought of a family dinner made my stomach churn. Alexander didn't say anything. He grabbed his bag from the trunk and walked into the house without a word. The rest of the afternoon was spent doing chores. I folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, and reorganized the bookshelf in the living room, anything to keep myself busy and distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to Alexander. I replayed our conversation from the night before, the way he had talked about feeling lost, about pretending to be someone he wasn't. I remembered the quiet understanding in his eyes, the kind I hadn't seen from anyone in years, certainly not from Levi. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Hey," I replied. My voice coming out more strained than I had intended. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat and glanced toward the kitchen. "I was just going to grab something to eat," he said. I stepped aside to allow him to pass. He brushed past me, and even though the contact was brief, it left me feeling breathless. I busied myself with tidying the counter while he rummaged through the fridge, trying to ignore the way my heart raced whenever he moved. "Last night," he began, his voice hesitant. I felt my fingers tightening around the dish towel. "We don't have to talk about it," I said. "We can't just pretend like it didn't happen," he replied. "Why not?" I asked, my voice sharper. "I meant, that's exactly what we need to do. Pretend it didn't happen and move on." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you really want?" "What I want?" "It doesn't matter," I replied, my voice trembling. "This is, whatever I want, this is it. It can't happen again." "Why not?" he demanded. "Because it's wrong. Because it's inconvenient. Or because you're scared." "Stop it," I snapped, turning away. He stepped closer to me, his voice now softer. "You don't have to keep pretending, Abigail," he said. "It's not with me. Please." I whispered, my chest tight. For a moment, I thought he might argue or push me further, but instead, he sighed and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." "It's already challenging for me," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned and left the room. That evening, Levi was in his usual cheerful mood, chatting about work and plans for the future. Alexander and I both played along, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but the tension was unbearable. At one point, Levi turned to Alexander, his expression curious. "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Alexander replied, but Levi quickly forced a smile, exhausted from the trip. Satisfied with the answer, Levi continued with his meal. However, I could feel Alexander's gaze on me, heavy and searching. It took all my willpower not to meet his eyes. Later that night, after Levi had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the living room, my mind racing. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't hear Alexander come down the stairs until he spoke. "Can't you sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression cautious. He stepped into the room, his hands shoved into his pockets. Neither of us spoke. We stood there in silence, the unspoken tension growing heavier with each passing second. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Neither do I," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But I know I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a blow. And I felt my chest tighten. "Alexander." I was unable to ascertain the speed with which I spoke, my voice sore, but that did not entitle me to disregard it in relation to you. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "I know this isn't fair to any of us," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I just needed to hear you say it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going to go for a walk," he said, his voice barely audible. "Be careful," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. He nodded before disappearing, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling as Levi slept soundly beside me. I felt trapped, as if the cage of my own making had closed around me. And I couldn't escape. The next morning, Alexander had left. I found the note on the kitchen counter, written in his messy handwriting. I need some time to clear my head. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I simply need to navigate the situation independently. The word struck me deeply, and yet I gripped the note tightly, trembling as panic rose in my chest. What's that? Levi asked, walking into the kitchen with his phone in hand. Alexander has left, I said, my voice trailing off. Levi frowned, taking the note from me. What? What does that mean? Where did he go? I don't know, I admitted, tears filling my eyes. Levi sighed and ran a hand through his hair. That boy never thinks things through. He's probably sulking. His dismissive demeanor caused my blood to boil. He will return when he gets hungry. This isn't sulking, Levi, I snapped. He's clearly upset. Well, what do you expect me to do about it? He shot back. He's an adult. If he wants to act like a child, that's his problem. I stared at him, stunned by his indifference. You really don't care, do you? Of course I care, he said. Though his tone didn't match his words. But I'm not going to chase after him. He needs to grow up and deal with his own problems. I turned away from him, trying to steady my breath. The weight of everything bearing down on me. The days that followed were agonizing. I spent every moment wondering where Alexander was, if he was safe, and if he would come back. I tried calling him. But his phone went straight to voicemail. I considered driving around to locate him, but I was unsure of where to begin. One evening, as I sat in the living room staring at my phone, Levi seemed unconcerned, going about his business as if nothing had changed. My friend Luna called. I haven't heard from you in a while, she said, her voice filled with concern. Is everything okay? I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. It's complicated, I said finally. Complicated how? She pressed. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling a sigh. Alexander left. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back. Did something happen? She asked, her tone sharp. I hesitated again, the weight of the truth pressing on me. It's just been tense lately, I said, avoiding the full truth. Aha, Luna said, clearly unconvinced. Well, if you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. Thanks, I said quietly. But I wasn't sure I meant it. After hanging up, I sat for a long time, staring at the empty space where Alexander had once been. The house felt even emptier without him. I found myself reliving our last conversation repeatedly. I thought about how he had looked at me, raw vulnerability in his eyes. I thought about his question. The one I hadn't been able to answer honestly. Was it just a mistake to you? I didn't know. Maybe it was, or maybe it was something more, something I wasn't ready to admit. All I knew was that I missed him, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. The emptiness Alexander left behind was unbearable. Days turned into weeks. And the silence in the house grew heavier with every passing moment. Levi carried on as if nothing was wrong, burying himself in work and brushing off any mention of Alexander with a dismissive wave. He'll be fine, Levi repeated more than once. Once he always is, but I wasn't fine, and I didn't know if Alexander was either. I found myself driving aimlessly some afternoons, hoping and praying that I might catch a glimpse of him walking down a street or sitting in a cafe. I checked his social media obsessively, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was as if he disappeared completely. I couldn't help but feel that his leaving was my fault. The note he left was short, almost casual, but the timing couldn't have been a coincidence. What did I do to him? That question haunted me, pressing down on me no matter how hard I tried to distract myself. It was a Thursday evening when I found it. Levi had left for a dinner meeting. And I was alone in the house, aimlessly wandering from room to room. Without realizing it, I ended up in Alexander's room. The familiar scent of him lingered faintly in the air. I sat on the edge of his bed, my fingers absently tracing the seams of the quilt as I tried to imagine where he might be. My eyes landed on his desk, where a stack of papers was haphazardly piled on one corner. I told myself not to snoop, but my curiosity overcame me, and I picked up the stack, absently rifling through it. That's when I found the letter. It wasn't addressed to me, but I knew immediately it was about me. Dear Abigail. I don't know how to say this. I can't articulate it verbally. So I'm putting it in writing instead. I hope you never read this, but if you do, I hope it helps you understand. I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about that night. I know it was wrong. And I know it probably meant nothing to you, but to me, it meant everything. You make me feel seen, like I'm not just some failure or disappointment. You instill in me a sense of significance. And I'm uncertain how to respond to this. I've tried to let it go, but I can't. And I think that's why I have to leave. I apologize if I've made things more difficult. I never intended to. But I can't stay here anymore, not in this state. Take care of yourself, Abigail. Always, Alexander. I read the letter 3 times, and with each reading, the weight of it grew heavier, causing my hands to shake. When I set it down, my mind raced with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. He had left because of me, because of what had happened. Because of how I had handled it, or rather, how I hadn't handled it. Instead of feeling relief that he was gone, along with the temptation and risk he brought with him, all I felt was a deep aching emptiness that threatened to consume me. Levi came home late that night, his tie loosened and the smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes. He dropped his briefcase by the door and headed straight to the kitchen, pouring himself another drink without a word. I followed him, clutching the letter in my hand. Levi, I began, my voice trembling. He turned, looking at me with worn eyes. What is it, Abigail? I need to talk to you, I said, tightening my grip on the letter. He sighed, setting his glass down. Can it wait? I've had a long day. I surprised myself by firmly saying, no, it can't wait. He frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. I hesitated, the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to tell him everything, not yet. Instead, I handed him the letter. What's this? He asked. Just read it, I whispered. As he unfolded the letter. His eyes scanning the words, his expression changed from confusion to anger, then to something darker. Who the hell is this? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. It's from Alexander, I whispered. No kidding, he snapped back, holding up the letter. What the hell does he mean by this? What happened to you, Abigail? I felt the weight of his anger. His disbelief closing in on me. Levi, what did you do? He shouted, his voice echoing in the kitchen. I did not intend for this to occur, I stated, as my tears streamed down. It constituted an error. And an error, he reiterated, malice lacing his tone. Do you consider that a mistake? I was unable to answer. The burden of his fury was overwhelming. Levi departed that night, forcefully slamming the door, which reverberated throughout the home. I remained seated on the kitchen floor for hours, gazing at the letter clenched in my fists. I wanted to scream, cry, run away, and never look back, but I couldn't move. The following morning, I compelled myself to rise. The home was profoundly silent without Levi and Alexander, enveloping the atmosphere in an inescapable gloom.